Why do we got to die before we die?
You know, that phrase, in different forms, I would say, and this isn't exaggerating, is found in all of the great religions at the higher levels, not your beginner's level. The people who've really walked the journey for a while. The spiritual teacher, like Jesus, will always say, will always talk almost in an embarrassing way about dying. And if you hear it at an early level, you think it's morbid, or it's negative, or it's self-sacrificial, beat yourself up. That's not what they're talking about at all. But most people at the early level don't know that. What they're talking about dying is this, what I call the false self. That your initial view of life is with yourself as the reference point. It's all about me. I'm the center of the world, what I want, what I need, what I like, what I prefer. And as long as it's all about I, this little I here, you just don't see very well. You don't see truthfully. You don't see with wisdom. And that's why they're talking about dying. That you need a whole new vantage point. And the vantage point cannot be what we now call the private ego, or the mental ego, or me, what I think is me. That has to die. And for most people, especially Western individualistic people, this is just almost impossible to understand.
Self-preservation, that's what we're taught.
Yeah, it's all about the self. The small self, not the great self, the small self. And so they just think you're talking about being sacrificial. At best, that's the best way they hear it. Like we Catholics thought, give up meat on Friday. This is supposed to make God happy. Or if you're Baptist, stop drinking. I mean, that's fairly easy, really, compared to the death we're talking about. That I stopped looking at life from me as the centerpiece. That's the dying. That every great spiritual teacher, Jesus, the Buddha, our great Catholic mystics, they're all talking about dying all the time. And most people at the early level don't get it. So if you start at that beginner's level, that's where I started, that's where you got to start. By learning little formulas or techniques or Bible quotes or prayer forms. And that's okay. It gets you in the right ballpark to begin the conversation, to begin the dialogue with the great mystery that is God. Now, if you stay in that ballpark long enough, your questions will considerably change, and your image of God will considerably change. By the way, it gets much better if you stay in there. But if you just stay with your initial formulas and Bible quotes that you interpret in a childish way, I'm afraid you don't get very far. In fact, you even regress. And that's, I'm afraid, what happens inside of much of organized religion, is that, I say in my book, Falling Upward, that, and I'm a priest. I'm a priest in good standing, so I'm still...
Sure?
I believe it or not.
Get on the way right now. Check that out. Not to admit that, they bet it. Credit checkers with the fact check. Fact checking. Fact check the fact checkers.
That's great. I mean, it even surprises me. But I think it's because the bishops, the powers that be, they know I'm Orthodox, that I'm speaking from the scriptures, from the tradition, and from the deeper tradition. And you have to know the tradition well enough to know how to use it to defend yourself. And that's what Jesus did. He knew the Jewish tradition better than the scribes and Pharisees did. And so when they'd come at him with their superficial critiques, he would just slice it up, because they didn't know what they were talking about again and again. And I say that not about myself, but the Franciscans, the Catholic Church, educated me in very good philosophy, very good theology, and very good psychology. And they didn't know what they were doing because they gave you all the tools to come back and say, well, why don't we do that then? Why don't we follow this good theology that we say we believe? That puts you in this wonderful position I call it the edge of the inside. Where I'm still, believe it or not, I'm still an insider. I know I'm not dressed like one. But I could wear the brown robe if you want me to wear that. I know how to do the tradition. I know how to respect the tradition. And ironically, it's been that tradition which has given me the tools to critique the tradition. Isn't that amazing? And that's the way you can survive. It's the only way you can survive in any system. If you go too far outside and throw rocks, you're dismissed, do you see? Because you haven't earned the right to speak. But if you pay your dues to any system and say, I know the rules of the game, and I know when the rules are working and when they're not working, and when they're just self-serving rules and not really achieving the purpose. Like, as you know, in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, the law says, I say. The law says, I say. He says that 6 times in a row. I know the law, and I know what it really means, and that's why I'm saying this. But I'm 69. I mean, it's taken me...
You look good, brother.
It's taken me all my life to learn this and to learn how to say it in a way that people can partially understand.
Can you talk about some of those? Are there a couple things that, from education to enlightenment, that you remember as whether it's a death or a revelation or transcendence?
Well, it was just again and again working with concrete people, like the 14 years at the jail, where I knew the rules, I knew the laws, but I saw that by and large, these laws were defeating people. They were not transforming people. They were humiliating people and shaming people and excluding people instead of drawing people into this great mystery of grace and God and freedom and forgiveness. So it takes you years to struggle with that.
Draw murders into chaos, we'd have chaos.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, or not just murders, rapists and all the rest. And pedophiles too. I've worked with pedophiles who are the acceptable lepers today. But for some reason, God created them too. I mean, the circle just gets bigger and bigger. How are we going to deal with this God who is grace and mercy and forgiveness in a broken world? So it's been the trying to bring the gospel to the world as it is. Now, already in the late 70s, because I made cassettes back in the early 70s, I started getting invited to give retreats in Latin America, in Philippines, in Africa, in Asia. And that was the social education, you know, where it wasn't just meeting broken individuals or shamed individuals, but meeting entire cultures where nobody had any rights, nobody had anything in many cases. And so you had to call your whole American myth into context and into criticism too. Not saying that it's all bad, but recognizing that it's not all good either. And that we've been told a lot of things that are only half true. But half true is enough to work with.
I need true or false.
Yeah.
I need one or the other.
Yeah, that's what we call dualistic thinking. And those are most Americans, and even most educated Americans, are just educated dualistic thinkers. You understand? They still see everything in terms of black and white. And that's why education is different than transformation. Education is different than enlightenment, right? And you can have 3 PhDs and still be in the kindergarten of enlightenment. We all know people like that. You can be a head of state and be spiritually childish, as we know. And you can be cleaning your hotel room, an uneducated Filipina or Mexican lady, and you find a smile on her face and you want to shake her and say, where'd that come from? So this is what Jesus meant when he says the last are going to be first and the first are going to be last. It's not like you think. This world is not like you think. And unless you get these new eyes, you don't see that.
Why do we gotta die?